Okay, hello. Welcome everyone to the virtual book launch of China Goes Green at NYU Shanghai. This talk is hosted by the Center for Global Asia and co-sponsored by the Global China Studies Program. My name is Selena Hong, Assistant Professor of Literature and the Center's Interim Director for this academic year, acting on behalf of Director Tansen Sen. Today, we're very happy to begin the Center's year-long web events with this exciting webinar. I'd also like to take this opportunity to announce that over the next 3 months, we will continue to run a multidisciplinary lecture series on topics related to global Asia, also on Zoom. So please stay tuned for more event announcements on the Center for Global Asia website. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to request that our audiences please do not record this session. We will record the webinar and make it available in the events channel of our website. Now, I'm very honored to welcome today's moderator, Dean Maria Montoya of Arts and Science, who is Global Network Associate Professor of History at NYU Shanghai and Associate Professor of History at NYU. Dean Montoya will introduce the book and the two authors.
Okay, you would think after 9 months of this, I would know how to unmute myself, but here we are. I'm so pleased to be doing this webinar today and to introduce the two authors and the book. It's a really exciting piece. Our two authors who are with us today is first of all, Judith Shapiro. She's the director of the Masters in Natural Science and Sustainable Development for the School of International Service at American University, and also the chair of the Global Environmental Politics program there. She was one of the first Americans to live in China after the US-China relations were normalized in 1979. And she taught English at the Hunan Teachers College in Changsha, China. She's also taught at Villanova, the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Aveiro in Portugal, and the Southwest Agricultural University in Chongqing, China. She was a visiting professor at the Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University. Professor Shapiro's research and teaching focus on global environmental politics and policy, and environmental politics of Asia, and the Chinese politics under Mao. She is the author, co-author, and editor of 9 books, including with Ife, China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet, China's Environmental Challenges, Mao's War Against Nature, and also Son of the Revolution, After the Nightmare, and also Cold Winds. A big welcome to Judy for joining us today for our CGA event today. So welcome, Judy. Our other authors, my colleague, Ife Li, who's Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at NYU Shanghai, and also the Global Network Professor at NYU. In the 2021 academic year, he's also going to be the Residential Fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for Environmental and Society in Munich. His research concerns both the macro-level implications of Chinese environmental governance for state-society relations, marginalized populations, and global ecological sustainability, as well as the micro-level bureaucratic processes of China's state interventions into the environmental realm, which you'll see all in this book. He has received research support from the U.S. National Science Foundation, the University of Chicago Center in Beijing, and the China Times Cultural Foundation for other resources. He's also the co-author with Judy on China Goes Green, and his recent work appears in Current Sociology, International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Environmental Sociology, Journal of Environmental Management, and other scholarly outlets. He received his master's and PhD degrees from sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his bachelor's degree here in Shanghai from Fudan University. So welcome, Ife, and welcome, Judy. Great. I want to sort of get right to the questions. But before I get started, I think it's really timely that this book has come out at this particular moment. It is clear we are at a precipice in dealing with the impact of climate change All it takes for those of us who live in the United States, having spent the last few months, in the summer I was in the American West in Colorado, and between the floods, the fires, we are beginning to really see the impact of climate change. And so is most of the population. I think for the first time, it's really becoming a visceral concern for global citizens and for Americans as well. And I think it's very clear that there's no way we can really have effective mitigation of climate change unless China participates in a meaningful way. And I think I would even argue that there's no way we can really affect change unless China takes some sort of leadership role in making these changes to create a real impact. The fact that China and not the US has stayed in the Paris Accords for climate change, I think says a lot about the current sort of state of these policies. So I really want to spend some time today talking with our two colleagues, getting their take on how we sort of balance this and how we begin to move forward. So I'm going to start by asking you both a question. I'll let you guys talk. We'll go on for a little bit. And then probably about a half hour or so, we'll open it up to questions from other people on the Zoom session today. So Judy and Ife, in this book, it seems to me that you're really arguing that coercive environmentalism is some kind of sliding scale. It's not just an on-off switch. And I think in the final analysis, simply having the government just dictate a policy and then follow up with strict enforcement is not entirely effective. And I think you guys do a really great job of showing that. And you both seem to be arguing that there needs to be educational campaigns and a certain amount of buy-in from the public, even in a country like China, in order to create a truly successful program. And I think on the other hand, you both would argue that voluntarism alone isn't going to solve the problem. You need some kind of enforcement mechanism in order to make this successful. So in your minds, what's the perfect balance between voluntarism and coercion, and how would you sort of set up that balance?
Thanks, Maria. That's a really good question. I think it may be helpful to just set up our discussion a little bit by, first of all, telling the reader a little bit about where Judy and I come from in terms of this project. One of the main things that motivated us in coming together to write this book is really our concerns that we're seeing a lot of scholars and observers and commentators in the West speculating the possibility of what they call authoritarian environmentalism. The idea that you can use authoritarian means to achieve environmental ends. And if the end goal, environmental protection, is noble enough, then this seems to be enough to justify the use of draconian authoritarian measures. And we, in this book, try to evaluate that hypothesis. We set out to look for actual examples of authoritarian environmentalism, which really is the foundation of this book. But what's really interesting about our process of researching and writing for this book is that we're not finding exactly the kind of authoritarian environmentalism that scholars and commentators have been speculating. On the contrary, what we conclude in the book is that we're finding a tendency to go into environmental authoritarianism. Now, what do we mean by that? What we mean is the idea or the hypothesis of authoritarian environmentalism is that you use authoritarian means to accomplish environmental ends. But what we're finding out in many of the cases is the tendency to use environmental justifications to consolidate the reach of authoritarianism. That suggests to us is precisely the kind of tension that Maria, you were talking about earlier, in terms of this spectrum of observations in which on the one hand, we've got great environmental ambitions and intentions on the part of state actors, but using draconian measures to accomplish them. On the other hand, we've got a lot of environmental pretexts and green cloaks for what in fact turns out to be geopolitical ambition or citizen control agenda or various aspects of the authoritarian agenda that's at play. What we try to argue in this in this literature, in this landscape of observations, is that we don't necessarily need a middle point, but what we do need is to place state power firmly in check. We need citizens, we need scientists, journalists, filmmakers, NGOs, and civil society actors to come in and play a more significant role, to play a more active role in not necessarily challenging the state, but more importantly, to assist the state, to hold state power in check, to ask for transparency, to advocate for environmental sensibilities and experiences that may not be immediately apparent to state actors. So that's, I think, what, at least in my view, is the most important argument that we're making. But to Judy, please add if I've missed anything.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say I'm really, really happy to be here in Shanghai from my home in Washington, D.C., where we're not providing great leadership to the free world here in Washington, D.C. So let me say, I thought Ife did a great overview of the core arguments of the book, but let me sort of say it again in my own words. I think there were two main impetuses for the book. The first being the sense that democracies seem to be failing at dealing with global environmental problems, whether it's climate change or biodiversity loss or other problems. And therefore, there's this sense that we're running out of time and all we need is a green dictator and everything's going to be much, much better. And so sometimes that might be true, right? I just read that China has banned those little bottles, the plastic bottles that you get for your shampoo in hotels, you know? Yeah, who really needs that, right? But what we found in as we researched this is that more often than not, the Chinese state uses a cloak of green to further authoritarian aims that it had already, even before environmental concerns became so paramount. So you can think about, for example, the term ecological migration, which sounds on the face of it like something great, like maybe, I don't know, coastal communities decided not to rebuild after a hurricane and rather to recognize that sea level rise and extreme weather was making that area not hospitable. But that's not what ecological migration means in the Chinese context. Rather, it means that nomads are being asked to settle into urban settings where the state can keep an eye on them, whether that's in northern China or western China. And the Chinese state has been trying to, quote unquote, pacify the borders for centuries, but now finally they have another reason to do it. Same thing with the dam building spree, right? We call that in the book green grabbing. The motivations for building these dams may or may not be to achieve some kind of renewable energy target. But when the state tells a community that's going to be displaced that they have to do it, they have to agree to be displaced because of some kind of international commitments that China has made to achieve sort of a low carbon growth or even carbon neutrality, it makes it that much harder for these communities to resist. So those are the two main impetuses. And while I have the floor, can I'll give you a really quick overview of the structure of the book. The book is organized in 4 parts. We focus on the more developed eastern part, the less developed western part, the Belt and Road Initiative, and even the global commons where China is embarking on what we're calling outer space environmentalism. And for each of those sections, we identified tools that the state tends to rely upon. And those tools include things like campaigns and crackdowns, target setting, behavior modification, one-size-fits-all policy making, green grabbing and ecological migration, which I've already mentioned, sort of a discourse of win-win development, green technocracy, and engineering the atmosphere. So those are just a taste, but that's the general structure of the book. And The last thing I want to say before I yield the floor back to Maria is just that it's been an incredible delight to work with Ife on this book. I cannot think of a more seamless collaboration that I've ever had in my life. He was in Shanghai, I was in DC, we're working on a Google Doc, wake up in the morning, oh, look at all this great stuff that Ife has done, go back to sleep, you know, and we really complemented each other beautifully, and we're very proud of the book that we've produced together. So I hope people will have a chance to read it.
Great, thanks both of you for that. That's a great overview. So maybe could you talk a little bit about how you see these two sides balancing, right? I mean, how would you answer, Western democracies who do feel like, we're being failed by our governments and we're not being effective and we're not meeting, our own goals, in particular in the United States. I mean, what are some of the tools that, we could take from your research, and how could that be sort of used in a more balanced way?
Thanks, Maria. Maybe it's useful here to share a few examples from the book. We structured the book to have many, many case studies, and really these case studies formed the very foundation upon which we built our entire argument. One of the cases that we spent a lot of time researching into and looking into, and in fact, in my own previous work, I also talked to many of the officials that were involved in these projects, was the rehabilitation of the Loess Plateau in northern China. One of the most remarkable aspects of the project was how the project itself had the Chinese state at the very center. Various central state agencies and provincial level state agencies got involved in deciding the overall trajectory of the project. But it was by no means a project that was single-handedly led by the Chinese state. It involved World Bank experts back in those days, and many of these World Bank experts weren't Chinese. It was a team of international and domestic experts. It was, most importantly, a multidisciplinary group of experts that involved ecologists, chemists, forestry scientists, sociologists, and economists. Now, the point of pointing that out is that this group of experts worked in such close collaboration with local communities for 2 good years. They didn't do anything, they didn't implement any project on the ground during these 2 years. What they did was that they engaged in a fact-finding mission in 2 years, talking to community members, talking to villagers, trying to understand what they have been going through and trying to understand what they did in their livelihood choices that led to environmental degradation in some parts and perhaps helped them restore certain aspects of the ecosystem in other aspects of their life choices. And they also interviewed people to find out more about what they remember from previous generations, what they remember from their grandparents who may or may not have told them about the past experience on the Loess Plateau. And it was through this 2-year process of finding out about the local livelihood conditions and ecological knowledge that's held in these communities that the World Bank experts and the Chinese government agencies were able to come together to formulate a rehabilitation plan that not only made ecological sense, but also made social and economic sense. And this plan still, till this day, works extremely well because people find economic incentives to conserve the environment, but while at the same time, they can make a living out of the landscape. They can have cash crops, but at the same time, there are certain parts of the land that's set aside for conservation and rehabilitation. That level of commitment, care, and thought that goes into the program speaks to the centrality of, on the one hand, we need very strong and decisive state actors that are willing to commit political and financial resources to rehabilitate damaged ecosystems. But on the other hand, that level of decisiveness has to be matched with a broad base of support from the community, from scientists, from all kinds of scientists who see different aspects of the ecosystems, who see different aspects of the community lives. And that kind of collaboration is what we think most representative of what can be a successful model.
But I guess I just follow up and say, in your experience, in your research, was that something that you saw over and over again? Was that part of this China state apparatus of planning these things? I mean, I think, you know, my sort of sense is a lot of things are just top down, right? They just come from some government policy and they fall down on this. But what you're talking about is really a much more organic process. So how often does that actually happen?
Right. If I can continue on this story, and in fact, you know, we documented the initial success of the Loess Plateau, and then we documented how, in the haste to replicate, quote unquote, the success of the Loess Plateau experience, the local government, and then working in collaboration with the central government, wanted to scale up that rehabilitation model. And in the end, what they pursued was to just rapidly expand monocultural forests across the entire region. Now, that urge to expand, that lack of attention to local conditions, resulted in huge expansions of monocultural forests, which as a result damaged a lot of the ecosystems, because these trees just didn't fit so well with a larger scale ecosystem. So I think, you know, the initial story, notwithstanding the initial success story, notwithstanding the longer term pattern that we're documenting, is indeed, Maria, like you pointed out, that we're seeing a lot of top-down interventions that lack the kind of thinking, the kind of care that's necessary to produce success. But Judy, you might want to add something to that as well.
I just want to add quickly that what Ife is describing is this phenomenon of target setting gone awry, right? So there's a very quantitative technocratic approach that the state often uses, and lower level officials are always looking upwards to see whether they're going to get promoted, whether they're going to get demoted. We saw that problem with the coronavirus when it first broke out, right? The lower level officials were afraid to give bad news to the leadership, so they suppressed this. So one of my favorite examples in the book, even though it was just short-lived, but I think it really illustrates the problem, is that last summer, there were very strong anti-air pollution targets that had to be met. And in Henan, some of the local people were using their threshing machines, and the chaff in the air created these artificial spikes in pollution readings. And so the local officials banned the use of threshing machines, and those local farmers lost their entire crop. So this is an example of how this kind of emphasis on meeting targets, I mean, it's almost like a Mao era kind of thing, right? Like the Great Leap Forward or something. This emphasis on meeting quantitative targets often ends up harming some of China's most vulnerable and doesn't achieve the goals that they're intended to achieve. Similarly, Ife identified a situation where there were a certain number of wastewater treatment plants that had to be built within a certain amount of time. And so they were built like crazy, but most of them weren't linked to the grid. And by the time they were going to be linked to the grid, they were old technology. And so they ended up basically having been a waste of effort, money, and time. So we see this kind of pattern quite a lot.
Great, thank you. Could both of you or one of you describe what you would consider to be the most successful case study that you found in your research?
Yeah, you know, one of the cases that I really enjoyed learning and writing about was the Chinese waste import ban, which came into effect January the 1st of 2018. There was a lot of discussion around the start of 2018 that the ban was going to come into effect. It was going to cause huge disruptions in the global waste economy and so on and so forth. I think, you know, these impacts were true, but a lot of these discussions simply failed to recognize that this ban was not so abruptly advanced. It was, in fact, a policy that has been in the making for well over a decade, if not 2 decades. The reason why we say that is because China has consistently been tightening up its import restrictions on recyclables, whether it's recyclable paper or plastic or metal or what have you. The goal has always been to tighten up these import controls in order for Chinese domestic recycling industries to slowly respond to these changing policies and in turn slowly upgrade the domestic recycling industry. Now, what we see in this case, once again, is that the state acted decisively, but it was successful only to the extent that it consulted extensively with local recycling businesses. And also, we have to acknowledge the role of so many filmmakers who actually was making a lot of documentary films. The global actor by the name of Basel Action Network was involved in a lot of the local filmmaking and advocacy groups. These efforts enabled the Chinese state to sensitize itself to these various concerns on the ground, whether it's the businesses or the individual recyclers or the individual workers who work in these facilities. To the extent that the state was fully sensitive to these concerns, it was able to put together policies and gradually upgrade the waste import ban to such an extent that it has very successfully fostered a domestic recycling industry. But also more importantly, another aspect of this case is that internationally, as soon as China announced that it was going to ban the import of various kinds of recyclables, many other countries in Asia followed suit. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, all issued similar kinds of waste import bans, to the extent that globally we're seeing almost a global movement to reject these waste shipments coming out of North America, Western Europe, and Australia and New Zealand. And also what we're seeing in terms of a welcoming sign of change is that places like California are now reforming their own recycling industry, not only in the sense of processing a lot of recyclables on the ground in California, but also a lot of initiatives to encourage citizens and also to incentivize citizens to reuse more. And we think, a lot of that is because how successful the Chinese waste import ban actually is.
Great. Judy, you want to tell us what you think?
Yeah, I mean, I want to cover so many more questions, but I just want to say that that really made me feel happy for the planet. I know that for Americans, it was like, oh my God, China's refusing to take our recyclables. And, you think you're so people think they're virtuous because they recycled. That's like step one of being an environmentalist. I'm an environmentalist, I recycle, but they don't think about where that stuff goes. And the film Plastic China, which I just showed to my undergraduates, such a beautiful film, because you can see this migrant worker family and this little girl who can't go to school, and she's playing with brands, wrapping from brands that any American would recognize. That really hits home the notion that, your mother said you should clean up your own room, right? We can't keep displacing this environmental harm onto the planet's more vulnerable. So I think it's a fantastic move on China's part.
Great, good. So we have a question from an audience member. So it's a great question. So I think I'll start with that. Kate Wedgwood asks, she says, in 2004, Elizabeth Economy speculated in a well-received book, The River Runs Black, that citizen environmental activism in China might lead to a wider political change. What do you think about that? And she goes on to say, it seems from what you've been saying so far that rather than civic movements leveraging the environment for other political projects, what you're really talking about is how the state is leveraging these environmental movements for their own political projects. So maybe you can sort of answer both sides of that. It's a great question.
Yeah, I want to say that for the longest time, some sort of pro-democracy people in the West were looking at China's environmentalism as if this was going to be the beginning of the fall of the wall in some way. And this kind of notion that environmental activism was going to be some kind of wedge for other kinds of political change was A, misinformed, and B, was not doing the Chinese environmental movement any kind of favors. It's true that for environmentalism, there's been political space that hasn't been available to groups that are working on in other sectors, in other areas. But the Chinese environmental, we think about civil society in the West as existing in that space between the individual and the state, and also working sort of against the state in some way or to counterbalance the state in some way. In China, that's not the way it works, right? All of you in the audience know that, right? To be an successful environmental group in China, you need to have partners inside the state. And that's not that different in some ways from what happens in the West. There's a lot more penetration by the state of civil society than many people would think. Look at Gramsci's notion of penetration, right? But still in China, there's a tendency in the West to look at the Chinese state or party state as monolithic, but it's much more complicated than that. And there are groups and forces within the state that are really trying to deal with environmental issues. And this is not only because they are tree huggers, which they're probably not, but because the legitimacy of the Chinese state rests on dealing with this very intense pollution of air, of water, of food. And the state also understands the long-term implications of climate change with glacier melt and then ultimately floods and falling aquifers and sea level rise and extreme weather events and so on and so forth. The state understands that perhaps more so than the ordinary Chinese citizen who's worried about breathing and getting sick, right? So the push to deal with environmental issues is part of this packaging of the ecological civilization kind of national direction that Xi Jinping has articulated. And I think that's actually a fascinating concept. And maybe we can get Ife to talk about ecological civilization a little bit because he does it so well. But just to say, I don't think Elizabeth Economy had the right, that wasn't the right question really. But what's interesting is to see how Chinese civil groups have expanded their repertoire of strategies and tools over the years, from simple, in the Liang Congjie era of 自然之友, of picking up trash and planting trees, to all kinds of accountability politics, information politics, transparency politics that Ma Jun has done with providing government data to ordinary citizens to empower them, or this app that Ife told me about originally, the Clean and Smelly Waters?
No, Black and Smelly Waters.
Black and Smelly Waters. Okay, maybe Ife, you jump in. The Black and Smelly Waters app, what a great app, right? So citizen science in a way, or citizen monitoring of pollution. That you see black and smelly waters, you take a picture, you upload it, and that puts all kinds of pressure. So the ordinary citizen becomes the eyes and ears of a government that doesn't have the personnel to monitor all these violations of pollution on the ground.
I want to first thank Kate Wedgwood for the question, and also thank Nick Young for asking the question. And thank you for the two of you to join our call. Your daughter, Tiantian Wedgwood Young, has been such an amazing student and colleague at NYU Shanghai. So thank you for everything. But to the question specifically, I think it's really important for us to understand ecological civilization. A lot of people shrug it off as though this term is just yet another propagandist creation for China. And I tend to think that there are real meanings, both discursive meanings and nationalist meanings that tend to be underappreciated, I think, in the academic literature. The reason why I say that is because ecological civilization carries with it a very clear intellectual baggage that is decidedly Chinese Marxism. And the other aspect is China's ambition to be the civilizational leader of the 21st century. Let me try to unpack each of that a little bit. Ecological civilization in many ways represents Chinese Marxists' work to expand the Marxian theory of the stages of development from agricultural societies to industrializing societies, to fully industrialized societies, and then capitalism, socialism, and communism. Now, Chinese Marxists are arguing in a fashion that's not unlike how Marx described the stages of development, that a previous stage of development has its own production conditions, and these conditions turn out to constrain the previous mode of development, and then they give rise to a new mode of growth, and ultimately growing into a next stage of social arrangement. Chinese Marxists are arguing that ecological civilization is this next thing. They're suggesting that after capitalism, they're envisioning a new stage of ecological civilization that previously weren't accounted for in the canons of Marxism. They're suggesting that China is going to be the empirical model for living out this new approach to the stages of development, this new addition to the stages of development. So that's really the intellectual side of ecological, ecological civilization. But there's another side to it, which is China has been, the official historiography has been suggesting in China that the 19th century and the 20th century were both periods of humiliation for China. China was great, China was glorious, was the longest continuous human civilization on the planet. But because of the century of humiliation, China has gone down. Now, what the Chinese Communist Party really sees itself as a primary goal of national revival is what they call the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Now, this argument of ecological civilization plays extremely well with this idea of China re-emerging on world stages as a renewed civilizational leader. They're not leading any just random kind of civilization, but they're suggesting that China is bringing forth a novel kind of civilization that they call ecological civilization. So because of these two strands of thoughts that come really together so well, that we're thinking that ecological civilization has its unique political meanings that has to be fully appreciated. So for Elizabeth Economy to suggest that environmental movements in some ways have the tendency or have the potential to initiate larger scale political changes, I think is a fundamental misreading of what environmental protection actually means in the Chinese context. But over to Maria.
Great. I think I want to pull a couple strands together here. And I'm thinking about, the way you talk about, how basically the United States, Australia, these other countries were basically offloading their trash, their recyclables to China. And I kind of want to turn that a little bit and think about the Belt and Road Initiative, right? And the way that China is sort of exporting this idea of ecological civilization to all these other countries through these various infrastructure projects. And of course, I love to talk about water all the time. And so I want to think about all the dams that are being built, right? Outside of China's boundaries, particularly on the Mekong, all over on that western border. And is the Belt and Road Initiative really a way for China also to export its trash and its needs, right? So you put the dams someplace else and you take in that electricity either to sell it or to use it for your own civilization. So how do these sort of two things begin to work together, and how does the Belt and Road Initiative fit into this idea of the ecological civilized society?
So there has been tremendous criticism of the building of coal-fired power plants on the Belt and Road. And I would extend the criticism to maybe an overemphasis on carbon and a continued technocratic approach. The thing that really gets my goat, as it were, is that there seems to be no understanding of the impact of habitat fragmentation. These infrastructure projects, when you build a railroad, when you build a high-speed highway, when you dig a deep water port, when you extract these resources in fragile areas, this has tremendous consequences for biodiversity. And as Maria, you're saying, they're also exporting a lot of these big dams, and also building big dams on the upper reaches of the Mekong, which is within China's borders, which is having tremendous impact all the way down through to Vietnam. Also a lot of tension with India these days, right? Because China controls the third pole, the water tower of the world. And so many of the dams, the rivers that go into South Asia and even into Central Asia are under China's control. I'm sure that people are really excited and interested by this commitment to go carbon neutral by 2060. And I think it's very interesting. I think is great, right? But we have to see whether all of these tools that we chronicle in the book about target setting and campaign style implementation, and sort of numbers obsession, if you will, whether those are put into effect while China is trying to go carbon neutral. And then even more importantly is the problem of what a scholar named Peter Doverne has called the shadow ecology of the country, right? So when you're calculating an entity's carbon footprint, whether it's an individual or an apartment building or a school or a city, people often forget to calculate what comes in and what goes out, right? So as long as China is exporting its excess capacity in coal, as long as it's carving up habitat, then we have to look more carefully at that claim of carbon neutrality and see whether, there's really no reason China couldn't be doing much more on this front. And they claim, oh, we're just respecting the laws of the recipient country, or, Sri Lanka wanted a coal-fired power plant. We're just giving them what they wanted. That, we're not being political here. We're not imposing ourselves on recipient countries. But in fact, they need to do much, much more. They need to meet at least their own standards rather than just looking at the standards of the Belt and Road countries.
I just want to add to that by pointing out that a lot of the Belt and Road initiatives the BRI programs are ostensibly green. The Chinese state actors are framing and marketing many of these initiatives as win-win, as green, as environmentally beneficial, but that simply doesn't square with empirical reality. We're seeing highways and railroads and infrastructural projects, deep water seaports that are cutting through sensitive ecological habitats, that are having very dramatic ecological consequences for the planet. So that part is simply a part that doesn't fit so well. But there's another part that's profoundly technocratic about China's undertakings on the Belt and Road, in the sense that China is actively exporting various kinds of technological tools to its Belt and Road partner countries, whether it's surveillance cameras for monitoring citizens. And once again, these surveillance cameras sometimes are framed as environmental tools that they're exporting on the Belt and Road, in the sense that they are describing a model of governance, which they suggest works extremely well domestically in China, when you can monitor citizens for everything that they do, from the kind of trash that they dispose of every day and the kind of recycling activities that they do, to the nomadic groups where they are every day, and the extent to which they can urbanize. So the argument for, quote unquote, the China model seems to be that if a state can deploy similar constellations of technological tools, they can also monitor their citizens so well that citizen behaviors can be modified into an environmental outlook. That is a very significant part of the BRI technological exports that we're documenting in the book. But it's not just that. We're also seeing that Chinese state-sponsored exports of Chinese-owned satellite data, remote sensing data, that they're trying to cover initially the entire Belt and Road, but ultimately the world at large, and then using these Chinese state-owned proprietary data to provide, quote unquote, development solutions to its Belt and Road partner countries. And once again, these quote unquote solutions are framed as being green, as environmental, as win-win, and yet the very foundation, the scientific premise of these solutions are Chinese state-owned proprietary data, which is not being transparently shared across the board, which is typically owned and housed at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and which controls the extent to which other parties can access this entire database. That technological aspect seems to be one of the most salient features of the Belt and Road Initiative, and we think there are some very worrying signs to that development. But back to Maria.
Great, thanks. So another question kind of following, I want to kind of finish up maybe sort of this international Belt and Road thing, but a question from Ivan. And I think Ivan's really asking you sort of at the international level, say in the last 10 years from Copenhagen, where China was being, really non-participatory, not a real leader in this field, to what we see today, where, China is sort of, picking up this mantle of being, the environmentalists in the wake of what's really just, the dropping the ball on the part of the United States and other countries. How would you explain this transition? What do you think are the most salient features of that transition, and what's the impact of that, both internationally and here back in China?
Well, nobody can read the minds of Xi Jinping, right? But I think for China, the environmental leadership is sort of a low-hanging fruit in that, as I said earlier, they already understand that climate change is going to have some very damaging impacts on domestic security, right? If, for example, Beijing doesn't have drinking water anymore, that could displace a lot of people. And we already see that in Shanghai, they're having to build a sea gate like they have in Rotterdam. As we saw, in earlier commitments around Paris, in some ways, China's commitments are the kinds of things they were going to do anyway, because they have the double win that they're thinking about, right? Dealing with ground level ozone and also mitigating their carbon output. So then I also think that China is very sensitive to its global reputation. And at a time when China is being criticized for behaviors, say in the South China Sea or in Western China, to be able to say, yeah, but we're, ecological. It's one way to kind of make up some of the balance. But as I said, I'm not a mind reader. I love some of the propaganda videos around the Belt and Road. There's one where, Xi Jinping is, he's speaking in this portentous voice about his boyhood in Xi'an, dreaming of camels and global connectivity. And by the end, there's like painted Pakistani trucks flying through the air. I love these videos, but they tell us a little bit about, this notion that China feels that they have to step up because the rest of the world needs Chinese greatness,
But I want to add to that, and thanks, Ivan, for the question, and a huge shout out to Ivan as well. In terms of China's environmental leadership, I think it's very clear that China will be the next global environmental leader. I don't think there's any doubt about it now that the US has so clearly retreated from that leadership position. And most importantly, China is eager to take up that leadership role. But what we really want to emphasize in this book is that in order for China to lead well in this global environmental realm, the Chinese state needs to be fully aware of the fact that it doesn't work if the Chinese state seeks to perpetuate this singular version of what it means to develop, this homogenized view that you have to urbanize, you have to be an urban middle class in order to be considered successful. And this view that a city park, and you can just expand the size of the city park and make it a national park and remove all of the residents. And I think that homogenizing view of what it means to be developed is profoundly problematic in many of the levels that we discuss in this book. As Judy pointed out earlier, we have multiple levels in this book. We look at the industrial East, we look at the West borderlands, we look at the Belt and Road, and then into the global commons. What's so striking is that China seems convinced, the Chinese state seems convinced through its domestic experience that it can just keep urbanizing nomadic groups. It just can keep imposing on an urban order on its citizens in the industrial West, to such a point that in many of the Belt and Road initiatives and into the global commons, China is pursuing a very, very similar agenda in terms of exporting its model of economic growth, to the point that I think many of the state officials are indeed well-intended, but that well-intention is premised on a complete lack of appreciation of alternative understandings of livelihoods, alternative approaches to everyday lives. And that lack of sensitivity, that lack of care seems to be the most problematic aspect. So in other words, if China wants to lead well in global environmentalism, it needs to, first and foremost, be fully sensitized to these alternative views of development.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that China's lack of experience in consulting with their own minority groups and with their own communities, then when they go out and they find out that, oh, there's something called indigenous rights, and they don't even know what an indigenous person is. And then they're genuinely like hurt. You know, they've hurt the feelings of the Chinese people when these people don't seem grateful. So there's got to be, it's almost like there needs to be cross-cultural sensitivity training or something like that. There's such a lack of appreciation for difference and respect for difference, and such a kind of an arrogance that the Chinese way is the best way for everyone. This would really need to change if China's going to be a global leader in this and in other areas as well.
Great, thank you. That's really, really interesting. I think to the audience, I'm really going to start just fielding the questions right now, and so they'll kind of come in random order. But I love this question. This question's from Sharon Zukin, and she wants to know: is anyone in China thinking about digital waste right now, dealing with the waste created by obsolete electronic devices and the demand for power sources to support data storage, given blockchain technology, and all sorts of things related to this kind of digital world that we're living in. I myself have an entire box full of all the digital junk that no longer works in my house. So, you know, what am I supposed to do with that? How are we going to deal with that? Has China begun to deal with that? They seem to be big producers of that kind of waste.
Right. Hi, Sharon Zuking, how are you? Shout out to you. Now, to answer that question specifically about electronic waste and the extent to which that is even being factored into policymaking, I mean, I think of an example of China Eastern, the primary carrier in the Shanghai region, rolled out these electronic luggage tags. And they have been just marketing these electronic luggage tags as a means to protect the environment. They're suggesting that each time you use this luggage tag, you're saving a sheet of paper. Now, that's an argument, but it's an argument that simply doesn't withstand any scientific scrutiny, because as Sharon alluded to in the question, there's just simply no attention to what this piece of electronic device is going to do to the environment after its end of life. And I think you're absolutely right, Sharon, that these things needed to be accounted for, whether it's these huge data centers in central China that utilizes a tremendous amount of hydropower to run these big data centers for the Chinese state and many of the other private enterprises in the country, or the tremendous volume of electronic wastes. We've documented a number of cases in the book about these so-called cancer villages, a few of which became these unfortunate environmental injustice cases because precisely of disproportionate amounts of electronic wastes that are dumped onto these villages. Now that China has imposed a waste import ban, I think to some extent that's going to help alleviate these communities out of environmental harm's way in very, very real senses. But still, I think there's a general lack of discussion of how to reuse electronic devices, how to create modular forms for the next generation of electronic devices. So whenever we needed to upgrade, we don't need to upgrade the whole thing. We can only take out whatever piece that's not working and then put in a new bit. But at least to my knowledge, there has been very little discussion on that front.
Mm-hmm. I do know there's a campaign, I don't know if it's still underway, I think it was a Greenpeace campaign against Hewlett-Packard, and they were doing street theater where they would say HP equals harmful products. And the idea is that you try to pressure, there's also Madryn has a whole electronic scoreboard, right? So the idea is that you try to pressure the manufacturers of these products to to make them in a way that they're more easily reused. So a lot of alloys aren't really necessary. They make shiny or they make it hard or something, but it's not really required, you know, for the use of this thing. So if manufacturers can manufacture in a more sustainable way, more reusable way, that will be a big step. And also, as we were talking about, you know, the recycling ban and America should clean up its own room, if the manufacturers are forced to take back their own products, not only of electronics, but cars, everything, you know, then that requires them to think more carefully about what they're doing in the first place.
Great. So just to kind of follow up on the idea of America cleaning up its own mess, its own bedroom. Lex asked the question, Lexa Lee says, in US politics, we often hear that China is investing heavily in green energy, and the United States and others need to step up in order to compete in this green energy market. She wants to know, is this a right interpretation of China's investments in green energy? And are these investments competitive in an economic sense? And what's a good policy recommendation for the US looking at these energy investments? Great question.
Yeah, Lexa, thanks for the question. It's an interesting question because green energy as a sector has perhaps been the most discussed policy area in China by these people who advocate for quote unquote authoritarian environmentalism. They oftentimes cite China's green energy promotion policies as evidence of what authoritarian environmentalism could accomplish. So in a lot of ways, this sector has been used precisely by these other scholars and commentators to make their case. We don't engage with this particular policy area in our book for a number of reasons. One is that the full life cycle environmental cost of green energy devices are really unclear at this point. We don't know, for example, what's going to happen to these wind turbines once they reach the end of life. What's going to happen to these solar panels? Now, we're not talking about an ordinary piece of electronic equipment. We're talking about equipments that are extremely high tech, that uses multiple types of heavy metals, that many of which aren't recyclable, and the device itself is simply not manufactured to be reused. So if we account for the whole life cycle environmental cost of these green energy appliances or devices or equipments, it simply is unclear whether the green energy is all that green at all. So that's really a scientific aspect of the green economy that we simply aren't quite sure about. The other aspect is, Alexa, I think as you alluded to in your question, is how sustainable is this whole model? We're seeing that the Chinese state using all kinds of subsidies to support the domestic green energy sector. And for those of us who live in Shanghai, we all know that if you buy an electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle, you get a free license plate from the city government, which typically costs something like 80,000 yuan. It could be higher. I'm not fully on top of these new developments, but I know it's extremely expensive. So that's one example of the state providing a form of incentive. But we also know that these individuals who purchase these hybrid or electric vehicles can't find enough charging stations in the city of Shanghai. And as a result, many of them have been using the traditional fossil fuel engine in lieu of the actual hybrid or electric engine that's available in the car. So in that sense, I think, policy-wise, we're seeing a lot of movement, we're seeing a lot of subsidy, but the extent to which that's actually environmental, the extent to which that's actually sustainable as a policy initiative are open questions at this point.
Do you want to add anything, Judy? No? Okay. Next question from Eric Sanderson. Hi, Eric. I've been thinking about you lately, actually, and he wants to know about wildlife conservation in China. And he, of course, is thinking especially about tigers in the Northeast. So how, we've talked a lot about air and fauna, but we talk a little bit about animals and any impact you've seen there.
So yeah, we have strong, passionate feelings about wildlife here. So we do have a section in the book, mostly as a positive example, particularly with respect to the shark finning ban. And then we explore also the elephant ivory issue, which of course is a harder sell in that the Chinese cultural appreciation for ivory carving is very deeply felt, much harder to deal with. And then of course the poor pangolin and you know, the whole strength of traditional Chinese medicine and the belief that you have to have the actual product of the actual animal, that chemical substitutions will not serve well enough, plus the rising middle class who can then afford this stuff, plus filial piety and the fact that, you know, if grandma can drink this thing and feel stronger, then, you know, I don't care how expensive it is, she's my grandma. So these things are really hard to change. You add also the relationship between wildlife consumption and the coronavirus and the potential for other viruses to hop from species to species becomes a very urgent issue. I know there's been a lot of progress in supposedly banning some of these wildlife markets, but they were banned after SARS too, and then they came back. So it's going to take a more serious political will than the government has demonstrated so far. I think that even, well, you know, this isn't my book, but years ago, that wonderful book, When a Billion Chinese Jump, the Guardian journalist chronicled that in visiting protected areas, there was a banquet with endangered species on the menu, you know, so these are really difficult issues. And the other thing is, of course, that they're so decentralized, right? So every little town has a little, you know, a huaniao shichang, right? Everybody, there's animals being sold everywhere. And, you know, as you see turtles in buckets on the sidewalk on a bridge in Beijing, right? So where do those turtles come from and are they endangered? It requires a lot of knowledge to understand that. So, you know, I sometimes despair. One time I was in New York City with some Chinese people and we were in Central Park and we were at the lake and there are all these turtles at the lake and these Chinese guests were like, oh my God, why isn't anybody eating those turtles? You know, so this is like a very deep thing. I you know, thank you for your work on the northeastern tiger. Yeah.
Great. I just want to encourage people, especially if they're students who are online, to put in a question. The next question is from, these three are kind of all together, but I think, let me start with Eric, so I think we can build off and answer a few others here. So our colleague Eric Hunman asks, and we haven't seen Eric for quite a few months, so hi Eric. I'm curious if your cases of environmental policy speak at all to the ongoing debates in China's studies about the central-local relations and the general narrative about greater centralization under Xi. What do you see in your cases? How centrally managed is China's environmentalism these days? And I'll let you answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Eric. Great question. Hope to see you back in Shanghai soon. But the question about central local relations, I think, you know, once again, we can use a number of different examples to think about how to answer that question. We're seeing in the environmental realm that a lot of the policies are being implemented, like Judy alluded to earlier, through quantitative targets. And whenever quantitative targets don't work, we see an escalated attempt to use political campaigns. And all of a sudden, these inspection teams coming from the central government arrives at the local scene and tries to enforce a certain central policy. We're seeing, for example, the high-profile case of the natural gas shortage problem back in the winter of 2017 and 2018, which came directly as a result of the central government sending a lot of these quote-unquote inspection teams to the local area, and local officials got so worried about them not being able to fill these targets to the extent that they over-enforced the switch from the traditional heating system to a natural gas-based heating system. And as it turned out, if everybody over-enforces a central government mandate, you end up over-enforce so much that the local areas simply didn't have enough natural gas to supply to all of these residential and industrial users. So that's sort of a primary example of how the Chinese government is using these instruments or tools, if you will, such as quantitative targets, such as campaigns and crackdowns, to gain even more centralized powers, to summon these local officials in line to enforce a given central policy in these past few years. But we're also documenting a situation in which, yes, there is increased centralization and consolidation of political power, but that is bad news for the environment. It may sound very great that a lot of these local officials are lined up to enforce a certain central mandate, but in the end, we're documenting close to non-existent environmental benefits, and we're also documenting tremendous human costs to these centralized enforcement mechanisms. Judy, you want to add
about just central-local relations? I think really a core theme of our book is the lack of access to supervision from below. So as long as officials are kind of always looking upwards for their performance evaluations and never being supervised from below, which is like the old mass line, right? It's in Maoism. We're not even asking, just saying, go back to your roots, right? Go back to this notion that the ordinary people have something to say. But there's such a mistrust of civil groups and ordinary people, and such a kind of it is the centralization structure. So there's been a kind of a turning back from the decentralization that we saw as part of the economic reforms after Mao died, I think, a re-centralization under Xi Jinping. And on the one hand, that allows the country to be, to make draconian decisions in a short amount of time. But on the other hand, the space, if you will, for public participation seems to have shrunk again after, the glorious 80s and then the oopsie in 89 and then sort of a expansion again. But it seems as if groups and ordinary citizens feel more and more squeezed these days.
Right. So Gukriti Singh is asking a question, and I guess I'll kind of riff on this a little bit. Your book came out, before the pandemic came, and so given the way that China reacted to the pandemic and its governmental response, a very quick lockdown, how does that sort of influence? Does it make you change your mind in any ways about the ways you've been thinking about this issue?
Well, with Donald Trump walking around without a mask, breathing on everybody, I mean, certainly this is a classic example of when one wishes that there could be a national mask mandate. And Biden has said that if and when, God willing, he is elected, there will be a national mask mandate. Sometimes we talk a lot about this phrase, which comes originally from Garrett Hardin, who's in the doghouse these days for being a racist and a fascist, but it is a very useful phrase, which is the phrase mutually agreed upon coercion, right? So if the people can buy in, if they can understand why there are these regulations, then these environmental initiatives and other initiatives have a very decent chance of succeeding. But if you spring it on the people, as they sprang the recycling policy on the people of Shanghai, then people are just going to throw their trash in the gutter because they don't understand. It doesn't make sense. They haven't been given any kind of a say in how it can work well. So I think with the coronavirus, there was a lot of suffering and complaining by the people when they were originally put on lockdown. But, ironically, Shanghai seems to be a lot safer than at least the area around the White House these days. So I don't know if Xifei has anything he wants to add, but China's done a pretty good job on the coronavirus after they screwed it up big time in the beginning.
Right, exactly. I was exactly going to say just that, after they screwed up big time initially. And we have to understand how that initial screw up came to be. It was precisely the kind of fear on the part of local officials that led them to suppress initial reports of positive cases, that led them to even persecute some of the doctors who were spreading information. And that level of suppression initially is quite simply the reason why the virus got out into what it was initially in Wuhan and now eventually in the whole world. So we definitely have to factor in. Now, the success of Chinese pandemic measures notwithstanding, I think, you know, I've experienced it. I was quarantined for 14 days. I was tested at the Pudong airport. It was completely uncomfortable, but the nozzle tests were just the most uncomfortable of all the 5 tests I have experienced this year. But still, that success notwithstanding, we really have to understand the initial mess and how it was created. And in the book, when we were submitting the final manuscript to Polity, our publisher, we managed to add a few paragraphs in different places throughout the book about the coronavirus pandemic. And I think we really have to understand the mandate to wear a mask, for example, and how it was initially framed. And also we have to understand in Hong Kong, for example, how the Hong Kong government introduced a local mandate that banned people from wearing masks just 2 months before the pandemic, because the local government in Hong Kong wanted to use facial recognition technologies to actually capture all of the protesters on the streets of Hong Kong. So that level of capricious movements on the part of state officials, whether it's in Hong Kong, whether it's in the mainland, I think are fundamentally problematic. And the beginning of the pandemic really speaks a lot to these problems.
And then how do you explain this, the change, right? In the way that, you know, really messing up at the beginning, but really within a month or two, making a real shift and adapting to the information that they had available to them at that point. I mean, the United States still hasn't made that shift.
Right, that's definitely true, which is, once again, in the book, we really applaud the level of decisiveness on the part of the Chinese state in many of their environmental moves. But once again, that decisiveness alone isn't going to cut it. That decisiveness has to be based on a broad base of support, a wide range of information that comes into the field of vision for the Chinese state. One of the things we really want to emphasize in the book is that we're not advocating for China to adopt the kind of US or UK democratic institutions. We're decidedly not advocating for that. What we're very simply advocating for is to revive an aspect of the Chinese political apparatus that Mao called political consultations. It's written into the Chinese constitution that the Communist Party is expected to consult with various political voices, various society groups, in order to make sure that the leadership of the Communist Party is not compromised by its single-minded pursuit of its own goals and agendas and interests. In the coronavirus as well, I think initially, precisely because the state acted alone, the state acted in defiance of what the medical scientists were telling them, acted in defiance of what these professionals were discovering on the ground, that it made a lot of mistakes at the beginning. But once it wrapped its hands around to begin to listen to these scientists, to let these scientists submit to them their most cutting edge reports of thousands of the initial cases, then they wrapped around and established these amazing control measures, whether it's in the city of Shanghai or in the country at large. So once again, the decisiveness is something that we truly admire, whether it's in the Loess Plateau or the waste import ban. And I think there's an element of that decisive move that is admirable in very real ways. But once again, it's just one element. That element has to go hand in hand with openness, with transparency, with a general willingness to listen to the people.
Great, thanks. A question from Roger Raffer. He says that China professes to want to use market-based thinking in its environmental management, such as national emissions trading, cap and trade, renewable energy certificate markets. How does this interact with environmental authoritarianism? And will these markets then actually work in China, or are they doomed? Right? That's the pessimistic side of that.
I can give a very quick answer to that. If we look at the carbon neutrality pledge from a little more than a week ago, we have to consider how China is going to achieve carbon neutrality. What we've seen on the ground is that the carbon cap and trade mechanisms or carbon markets in general have been the primary mechanism by which Chinese state make these carbon neutrality pledges. What it essentially means is that if you're going to host, let's say, a sporting event, you're expected to take account for the number of cars that you drive. You have to drive to transport people, the amount of energy that you have to use to heat up or cool down the stadium, the amount of water that you have to supply to individual participants, and so on and so forth. So you do a full-scale carbon inventory and figure out the total amount of carbon that's associated with said event. And then what happens is you compare your total figure to your carbon emission quota. Now, this is where things becomes a little iffy, if you will. The quota, in other words, is assigned to a given event or a given entity or a company or a community. But it's extremely unclear in the past and still not today how these carbon credits are allocated and on what basis are these carbon credits allocated. And when individuals and entities and companies have to go through these carbon cap and trade mechanisms in order to satisfy these carbon neutrality requirements, it gives the Chinese state essentially sweeping power to allocate carbon. And we have to remember that every single thing we do on this planet emits carbon. Whether we like it or not, we could figure out ways to reabsorb that carbon, to sequester that carbon. But whatever we do, you and I sitting right here using an electronic device is carbon emitting. And when that carbon cap and trade mechanism is being not exactly transparently set up, and Chinese state actors having the authority to allocate these permissible carbon emissions, I think that gives them an awful lot of power. And I'm not sure we're willing to give them that. But Judy, do you want to add to that?
Great. Jennifer Tao asked, I think, sort of a two-part question. And I think the first part is really asking, so, we've seen these taxes on plastic bags in New York. You don't get a plastic bag anymore, get in, or if you get one, you have to pay a nickel or a quarter or whatever for it. And we sort of begin to see these going throughout the United States. Is this a form of authoritative environmentalism in your mind? I know some red state people who would certainly think a ban on plastic bags is authoritative.
Well,
no.
It's not an outright ban, it's a tax, right? So if you plan ahead, you don't have to, then you bring your bag, right? When I first lived in China, back in 1979, there weren't these piles of trash everywhere because people use these net bags, right? You'd go shopping with your net bag and you'd fill up your groceries and take it home. And there was no packaging at all. And so we didn't see these mountains of trash. So I don't think that the plastic bag tax is a regressive tax. I even don't think that the bottle taxes are regressive, although Ife might disagree with me, because it's a voluntary thing. If you want to return your bottle, you might get 10 cents, right? These are incentivizing, but they're not so onerous that you can't pay your rent anymore. I mean, the coronavirus is so onerous that you can't pay your rent anymore. That's different. So I see that as more mutually agreed coercion, because also these are regional policies that are passed by various councils or governments or municipalities, and they vary greatly from place to place, but they're passed by elected officials who consult with their constituents as to whether or not to have these plastic bag taxes. So.
And hi, Jennifer Tao. Jennifer, I hope you can come back to Shanghai. I hope you can get your invitation letters soon to come in. But to answer your question about these bags, I think these bags have been so frequently cited by commentators outside of China or even within China as, yet again, evidence of the success of authoritarian environmentalism. China effectively introduced the new policy overnight. And now people all have to pay a small amount of fee to get a bag whenever they go grocery shopping. But also we have very limited evidence. I mean, scientists all over China have been trying to gather evidence of whether this policy has actually reduced the amount of plastic waste generated by the Chinese economy. There's very little evidence of that happening at all. And yet, at the same time, what we are indeed seeing in China is, the food delivery industry has grown so rapidly that, okay, you can't get a free plastic bag when you go to the supermarket, but you can order a lunch and get 3 plastic boxes, a packet of single-use chopsticks, and a plastic bag. And maybe if the restaurant wants to appear to be super nice, they double bag your lunch. Right. So yeah, on the one hand, we're seeing an attempt to reduce plastic waste, but on the other hand, in terms of the overall amount of waste that's produced by this economy, I don't think there's any evidence of a measurable effect of that ban. And also the fee that you have to pay is just so small that most people don't even care. It's a 10-cent fee, so it's really not a significant economic incentive in any way.
That's great. I think you did a good job of sort of answering Jennifer's second part of the question, was really like, how does this apply to the food industry, right? And I certainly saw this during COVID. I'm such a fanatic about not using plastic, not getting takeout, and all of a sudden you're in this world in which that's really limited to you because of the way you need to be sanitary, all these other concerns that are really impacting it. And I guess also thinking about, I think you both talked about this earlier, sort of this drive to have a certain kind of middle class income in China, and to be a certain kind of middle class person, right? That means that you don't cook for yourself, that you're getting all these other deliveries and things to your home almost immediately. So that's just a great question, Jennifer. I think it really goes to the how these things are just all so intertwined and so complex, when actually we just want really a simple answer, what's the best solution here. So that gets me to I think the last question here, and Alma's I think has a question that kind of wraps us all up really nicely, and she says, if environmental authoritarianism isn't the answer, then which regime types around the world are actually doing the best job on environmental management? And is there any evidence that China is quietly looking abroad at other models around the world to incorporate this into their own environmental management, either at the central level or at the provincial level?
That's such a great question, Almaz, and hi, Almaz. I feel like I know all the people who are asking questions today, and thank you all for asking questions. That's a really interesting question. I really like the aspect about whether Chinese state actors are actively looking at other examples for lessons that they can potentially learn. I think they indeed are. If we look at the publications and internal documents that come out of the various party schools, whether it's at the central level or the various local levels, they indeed are spending a lot of time trying to understand what other countries are doing, whether it's for the environment or for the well-being of the people, for various aspects of their policy concerns. So that's happening. But what we don't know, and once again, going back to Judy's earlier point, we can't read their minds. We're seeing a lot of evidence of them doing these fact-finding investigations, but it's unclear to us whether any of it is being implemented or even being implemented in an adapted form in China. In fact, in my next book, my dissertation book, I'm going to have an entire section about Chinese international collaborations. But what I am documenting in that chapter is, in fact, a situation in which a lot of Chinese state actors using these foreign entities, whether it's the European Union Commission in China or the German embassy in Beijing, as an alibi for what they have been wanting to do all along. They've been wanting to build a rapid transit system for a relatively sparsely populated city. They don't really have an economic, much less a technological justification for that, but then they enlist the support of a certain foreign entity and using their consulting reports as quote unquote an alibi for what they want to do all along. So I've been documenting a lot of these cases along that line. I don't think that fully addresses Alma's question, but I'll stop here, but we should talk more, Alma's, when we meet next.
I personally think that some of the governments that are doing the best job are enshrining a kind of non-materialistic set of values into their national direction, whether it's the concept of Pachamama or gross domestic happiness. I think there's something fundamentally flawed about measuring human well-being by material possessions and consumption. And yet this is the global system that we are operating under right now. And obviously the planet is, screaming for help. Whether ecological civilization has enough of that, I don't know, because there's so much of China is still intensely poor. The material basic needs are still not being fully met everywhere in the country. So it's hard to see how China could get off of this materialistic bandwagon, except that, I would argue, Maria said, I've done all this work on the Mao period, and, under the Mao period, they said Mao wanted us to be equal, but equally poor. And so as a result, after Mao died and there was the reform and opening, there was this pent up desire, to have like a cushion on your chair, because then under Mao, if you had a cushion on your chair, you were like a bourgeois counter-revolutionary roader, So this pent up desire plus, coupled with this notion of kind of don't think too hard, we're going to raise your standard of living and everything's going to stay sort of as it was, if you get what I'm trying to say, then this kind of need to continue to raise people's living standard becomes kind of the deal that the people made with the state. And so how China can get off of this materialistic bandwagon is not clear. We already see the preoccupation with luxury goods, with status symbols. And one of my favorite stories in the whole world is from Business Week. I don't have personal knowledge of it, but all these billionaires bought, some $1,000 bottles of wine, and they all got together as Chinese do to enjoy it communally, put a big punch bowl, they opened the wine and they all poured their wine in together, mixed it up and shared it. So this is like there's not a whole lot of, context, if you will. I remember being accosted on the street by somebody. She said, is Malika a good brand? Is Malika a good name? And I'm like, what's Malika? And then I figured, oh, it's Mary Kay Cosmetics, and she wants to become a Mary Kay salesperson. So I'm blabbering on here about this, but I feel as if, if ecological civilization could somehow incorporate a sense of humility and a sense of that the value, what matters in life is not whether you have a luxury car or a certain kind of status symbol, then that would be a very hopeful kind of a trend. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both. This has just been such a delight. I think not only the content of the book, which is just so timely and wonderful, but also seeing the two of you collaborate together. I think it seems like it's been a wonderful relationship for both of you and very, very productive. So congratulations to both of you on the book. You've gotten great reviews so far that I've seen. And so thank you for having me do this. It's really been a pleasure. I'm going to turn it back over to Selena, who I think will close out our session this evening. And thanks.
First, we want to say thank you, Maria. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Maria. And can I have the floor for just a minute more? I do want to thank a lot of people at NYU Shanghai. I just want to say that it takes a village. I have it actually printed out to make sure that I don't miss anything. It takes a village to write a book. In the case of China Goes Green, a big part of that village is called NYU Shanghai. Many of my friends and students and former students at NYU Shanghai offered encouragement, support, and assistance. I want to take this opportunity to thank a few of them. First and foremost, a huge shout out to Isabella Baranek, who worked here as a fellow and before that studied here as a student. She has been the first and most patient and thoughtful reader on multiple drafts. So thank you, Isabella. And to Qianchun Yuan, who goes by the name Kay during her time at NYU Shanghai, she helped translate and manage all of the citations in Chinese. And to Marcela Godoy, who generously shared her excellent artwork for this book. And to Ivan Willis Rasmussen and Bo Donners, both of whom gave helpful feedback on multiple earlier drafts. And also to Tian Tian Wedgwood Yang, who assembled the book's index and discussed so many of these ideas in the book during our numerous conversations over the years. And finally, I just want to thank Dean Maria Montoya for chairing today's event. I also want to thank Tansen Sen, Selena Han, Mingming Li, and Haozhe Li for hosting us. Thank you, everyone. I couldn't have done this without you all. And most importantly, thank you, Judy, for being such a great co-author. All right, back to Selena.
Thank you, Yifei. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Maria, for such a wonderful, extremely enlightening conversation. Just a quick note to all of the audiences, please order the book. We do have the book order form in our event website. Okay, so if you check our website, you can find the book order form. That's a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to CGA website. Have a wonderful rest of the evening and the day. More events will be coming up later in the semester. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.